and it will be available as you were just told. It will be available later, so you could always go back to it. They don't have to take frantic notes. It will be available to go back to again. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all of you on receiving your grant this year. I know it's been no small feat to get to this point, but you are here, so congratulations. My name is Glenn Zaponis. I'm the Executive Director here at the Historic Trust. So welcome and Happy New Year to all of you. The workshop is for our capital grants. If you received a planning grant, that workshop was yesterday, but rest assured, we do have a tape of that, so you could go back and see that recording if you missed it. So next slide, please, Kristen. So these grants are all part of the Trust mission of fostering good stewardship and providing financial investment for New Jersey's rich heritage. Our funds come from percentage of the corporate business tax. It's the same pool of funds that funds blue acres, green acres, farmland preservation, and open space preservation. Next slide, please. So, as many of you know, the Historic Trust is made up of 12 citizen members appointed by the governor, as well as 3 ex officio members representing the Department of Community Affairs, Department of Environmental Protection, typically the Historic Preservation Office, as well as Department of Treasury. Next slide, please. So here are the folks you'll be working with on a regular basis as you manage your grant and project. You'll get to meet most of them at today's workshop because we're all taking turns presenting. So if you haven't met them previously, you'll at least get a glimpse of them today. I'm also pleased to announce that our appropriation bill that will fund your projects passed both chambers of the legislature and was signed by the governor on Tuesday. So we're actually set to go with, again, what you'll be hearing today about being able to develop grant agreements. The governor has signed the legislation, so we are good to go on that. So I guess without further ado, again, welcome. I'm going to turn things over to Stephanie now to start with an overview.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Kraut, and I'm going to start us off with an overview of what we'll be discussing today. So this is a webinar, which means that the staff can't see or hear you as attendees. To communicate, we have access to a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and any questions you have can be typed into that designated section. We'll address any questions that are entered at the end of each section, as well as at the end of the webinar itself. And we'll be able to answer questions either verbally or directly into the Q&A function. Also, just to note, this presentation, like Glenn said, is being recorded, and you'll receive an email sometime next week with a link to it. The recording will live on our website, located under the Resources tab on our homepage. And again, that should be available by the end of next week. Next slide, Pete, please. So here's our agenda for today. I'm going to first briefly go over the grant agreement process and the grantee info packet and grant manual materials. Then the rest of the trust staff will discuss how we execute the grant agreements, how we define the scope of work, archaeological requirements, how to administer an active grant, how to close out a grant, and project publicity. And as previously mentioned, there will also be time at the end when we can address any remaining questions. Next slide. So the first step of the grantee process is to attend this workshop. Congratulations, you've all successfully accomplished that by being here today, and we are all very happy to have you. Your next step as grantees is to submit any supporting documentation in relation to your project and your grantee info packet. After the trust receives that information, we'll assemble those materials and send you 2 original copies of a finalized grant agreement for signature. Once you sign that and follow the procedures laid out in the manual, you'll need to mail that back to us. We then send that upstairs to the fiscal office here at DCA, and the grant agreement will be opened and executed at that time. So once the agreement's executed and all reporting documents are submitted, signage is in place, and the easement is in place if one is required, the agreement is open and active, and you'll be able to submit for reimbursements. Next slide. So there are two primary materials for you as grantees that are very important. The first is the grantee info packet, which you should have already received in an email from the trust staff earlier this month. This is a crucial document for executing the grant agreement. We can't move forward until this is fully completed and submitted to us. So please print, fill out, and compile all certifications and resolutions and mail physical copies to the trust by Thursday, March 28th. Additionally, we have the grant manual, which is a step-by-step guide outlining the grant agreement process and reiterating what we explained in this workshop today. This is a really great resource that'll be helpful as you go through the grant process, so please take advantage of it. Next slide. And that manual is available along with other resources on our webpage, www.nj.gov/dca/njht. On our homepage, there will be a big resources tag at the top of the page, which you can see an example of on your screens right now. And if you drop that down, there's a specific for grantees section. If you click on that, there will be different breakdowns depending on your grant type and subcategories with PDF documents of a number of different resources that can be helpful throughout the process. And this is also, like I mentioned before, where the recording of this presentation will be located. Next slide. And now I'll pass it off to Carrie, who will be discussing executing grant agreements.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Hogan. I'm the Trust Fiscal Officer. Today, I'll be covering the checklist of documents in your grantee info packet that Stephanie mentioned, which are needed to draft and execute your grant agreement. So the quicker you get these documents and forms filled out and handed off to your program officer, or PO as we call them, the faster your grant agreement can be drafted and executed. Please remember that the Trust cannot process any reimbursement requests without a fully executed grant agreement. Next slide, please. So the first form in your grantee packet is the checklist. The checklist itself, along with all the items listed on it, need to be completed and returned to your PO as part of your initial grant agreement package. Please note that the checklist and the items are not the grant agreement itself. They're simply what we use to create the contract. After the checklist, the first item you need to provide is the letter of acceptance. The second page of the letter of acceptance needs to be filled out completely and signed. By signing the letter of acceptance, you are agreeing to abide by the regulations that govern this grant program, including the requirement to inform your program officer at the Trust of all new developments that pertain to your grant project. Your PO should receive copies of all documentation for review and approval before you proceed with any work. Next slide, please. Next on the checklist is the information form. This is a simple form, but it's critical to creating your grant agreement and needs to be filled out completely. Notice here that number 3 on the information form is your vendor ID number. All grantees must be registered with NJ Start and get a vendor number. NJ Start is the state of New Jersey's mandatory procurement and payment system. Registration in NJ Start creates an account profile for the grantees so that checks can be issued for grant reimbursements. Please make sure that you enter your organization's EIN number correctly and put in your profile a good mailing address to which you will receive your reimbursement checks. The contact person and address that you enter into your NJ Start profile should match the name and address that's on your grant agreement. Incorrect information that you enter into NJ Start registration will delay the execution of your grant agreement and possibly payments on your award. Please note that most county and municipal entities out there are already in the state's vendor system via their EIN number. However, it's best to contact NJ Start directly to confirm that your preferred address and contact information are up to date, or else your grant reimbursement check could end up floating around from box to box at a city hall. So you'll want to update that, contact the helpline directly for getting registered in NJ Start and checking on existing profiles. Please contact the help team with any NJ Start vendor questions. There is their information down there. Also, please note that in NJ Start, you'll have the option to sign up for ACH or automatic payments. These are electronic payments that deposit grant reimbursement funds directly into your organization's designated bank account. So instead of waiting for a paper check to come in the mail, your approved reimbursement moves automatically to your chosen business account. Electing ACH can expedite your payments by approximately 2 weeks. Next slide, please. Next on your checklist is proof of insurance. All grantees must maintain insurance coverage for the entire term of your grant agreement. Grantees must provide a COI, Accord Certificate of Insurance, that's shown here. This is a standard document that insurance companies are very familiar with and can easily provide to you. So get in touch with your insurance company now and let them know that you need one. It shouldn't take more than a day or two for them to get it to you. Please note that New Jersey Historic Trust must be named as additionally insured in that lower left box of the Accord document that's highlighted in red there. Please also include your project number on the certificate. This way we can match up any subsequent Accord documents to your project file. Grantees must submit a COI Accord to the trust before the grant agreement can be executed. Missing or incomplete information will again delay the process. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the all-important Attachment E, governing body or board resolution. Your governing body or board needs to pass an official resolution certifying the amount of the grant you have been awarded and identifying by name the individual authorized to sign the grant agreement on your organization's behalf. The person that you name in Attachment E resolution must be the same person who ultimately signs the grant agreement. The resolution must have original signatures of the person approving the resolution, as well as the person attesting to the approval. Approved by and attested by should not be the same person. All resolutions should be certified with a government, corporate, or notary seal or stamp. If your board secretary or whomever does not have an official stamp, you're going to want to take your resolution to a notary for certification. And in fact, most nonprofits just go straight to the notary so that there's no question as to whether or not their approval signature is properly certified. Resolutions that are not properly certified will not be accepted, which will delay the completion of your grant agreement. And because sometimes it can take a while to get a resolution on your agenda, I would go ahead and get your resolution on the agenda of your next board or governing body meeting. Next slide, please. Next is Attachment G, the Statement of Adequacy of Accounting System. This is for your CFO or treasurer. Your CFO or treasurer must review the requirements of the grant agreement, including state audit and reporting, and then sign this form. The signing, by signing, your financial officer is agreeing to be responsible for establishing and maintaining the financial statements for your grant. Your CFO treasurer is also the same person that certifies reimbursement requests and signs all the payment vouchers. So please note that your CFO treasurer that signs this, Attachment G, cannot be the same person authorized by that resolution to execute the grant agreement. This provides the necessary checks and balances for healthy accounting. Okay, so that's everything on the checklist. And remember also that your grantee info packet, everything I've just gone over, is due to your PO by March 28th. Next slide, please. So once you've completed all of these forms in your grantee packet correctly, you will then surface mail it with original signatures to your program officer at the trust so they can compile your grant agreement. Next, 2 copies of grant agreements will be sent to you for signature and return. Upon return of both signed copies, Glenn Saponis, our executive director, signs them as well, and then the trust forwards them to the Department of Community Affairs Fiscal Services, and they establish an account for payment. And then finally, once the account is set up, the fully executed grant agreement is mailed back to the grantee, and then one remains with us at the trust office. So you get one and we get one. Please make sure to keep your copy of the grant agreement somewhere safe and easily accessible. It's a living document and should be used by the project contact and team as a guide for compliance, reporting, submitting reimbursement requests, and following mandatory audit guidelines. Are there any questions for this section?
We did have one question, just if you could clarify the requesting of the signature with a raised seal. Is that the notary seal or the organization's official seal?
Get it notarized, have it done by the notary. And sometimes it's official, it's a raised seal. And then lately we've been seeing a lot of just ink stamps.
And that was the only question for you.
Okay, thanks. Up next is my colleague Shannon Bremer, and she'll be talking about defining the scope of work for your project.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. As Carrie said, my name is Shannon, and I'm going to be talking about defining our scope of work. Next slide, please. So our attachment D1, or our scope of work form, is the component in your grant agreement that establishes the project being funded as well as the costs associated with each component of the project. All information in the D1 is based off the scope of work that each of you submitted last spring when you applied for grant funding. Every program officer will begin drafting the D1s over the next couple weeks, and then we'll send them to you for review to ensure that we have all the correct information. Once you guys approve and say, yep, we got everything that is expected in your scope of work, and we have your completed info packet, we'll begin formulating your grant agreement. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to briefly walk us through each component of the D1, which you can see an example of on the screen. First, we list out all of your general information, so the name of the grantee and or who is receiving the funding, the project name, project number, which was assigned to you, as well as your grant award amount. The very first section of our D1 is a brief history and statement of significance for the site, as well as a short description of the project being funded. The second section establishes the trust as the primary project review authority and describes the review requirements that we have for our grants. Our third section has two primary functions. The first part of the third section includes reference to your chosen consultants, minimum qualifications for all contractors, reference to the pre-qualification and bidding process, project reporting information, and the maximum non-construction costs that you can receive reimbursement for. The second part is where we very specifically define the scope of work being funded by this grant. For capital D1s, the scope of work is separated into two components, non-construction and construction. Our non-construction includes all the architectural and engineering services, as well as the bidding documents. The construction component is broken down by construction division and lists each element of the project's scope of work. This breakdown allows both you as the grantee and the trust to clearly see what's included in your project. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, the scope of work is broken down by a construction division. So we'll list out every division being covered in your scope of work, as well as the associated work items for each division. The screenshot that you see on the slide should look very familiar to all of you. This is the project budget worksheet that each of you submitted with your application last spring, and is where the staff gets all of the information when we formulate your D1s. There are separate sections for non-construction costs and construction costs. Your non-construction costs cannot exceed 20% of your total grant-funded project budget. So for example, if your total project was $150,000, your non-construction costs cannot exceed $30,000. We determine your total project budget by adding together your grant award and the minimum match requirement for your grant type. Then we multiply that total project budget by 20% to find the maximum non-construction costs that you can be reimbursed for. The costs for each division are taken from the project budget worksheet, as well as any proposals from consultants that you provided with your application. Archaeology costs are considered a construction expense, and this is to help encourage archaeology as an integral part of any capital project where there may be ground disturbing activities. Some language related to archaeology will also be added to your D1 scope of work if there are any ground disturbing activities occurring at any time during your project. This is done to make sure you're aware of all of the archaeological requirements that we have. My colleague Alexis is going to go into more about our archaeological requirements shortly. Next slide, please. So before I go over the final section of the D1 scope of work, I just want to explain another component of the attachment D1, our expenditure worksheet. This corresponds with the funded activities listed by construction division in the D1 form. As you can see from the screenshot of the expenditure sheet shown on the screen, it is broken down not only by non-construction and construction costs, but also by construction division. This document is meant to show both your proposed costs as well as any match expended you included in your application. As a reminder, match expended can only be considered if it is included in the original application and the work was completed within our required time frame. At the bottom of the expenditure spreadsheet, you'll find a running total of your non-construction and construction costs added together, as well as the breakdown showing your grant award, your required match, and your actual match based on the proposed costs you provided to us. The ratio section will basically show either a 1-to-1 match for our level 2 and 3 grantees, or a 3-to-2 match for our level 1 grantees. When all is said and done, this sheet should be close to, if not identical to, the project budget worksheet that you submitted with your application. Just as a heads up, some of the amounts may be slightly adjusted to account for all of our programmatic requirements, such as a temporary project sign as well as a permanent plaque. So do not be alarmed if some of the numbers are slightly off. Non-construction costs may also be adjusted as well to meet the 20% maximum requirement if it went over. As with anything else in the D1, if something doesn't make sense or you'd like any further explanation, or if something seems like it's off, please reach out to your specific program officer and they'll be more than happy to answer all of your questions. One final important thing to note is that we do not hold you to the dollar amount for each individual division. This is simply meant to be a guide for the project to make sure that our total project costs are running on schedule to where they should be for your required matching grant. Next slide, please. So the final component of the D1 is the project schedule. These are important dates associated with your project, including the commencement date of your grant, as well as the expiration date of your grant. I recommend keeping these on hand or posted somewhere that you can see them, so you're aware of all your deadlines and can plan your grant-funded work accordingly. That way you're not at risk of having any problems down the road. I'm going to go over our specific dates for our 2023 grant shortly, but for now, I just want to talk about the general timeline. So the grant agreement itself must be executed within 18 months of the agreement date. All work must begin within 24 months of the agreement commencement date. All work must be completed within 4 years of the commencement date. And then finally, the grant agreement will expire 5 years from your commencement date. Next slide. Right, as you can see on the screen, this is the project schedule for our 2023 capital grants. This schedule is based off the month and day that the governor signed the appropriation bill, and that date is known as your agreement commencement date. So that would be January 16th, 2024. For most of you, January 16th, 2024 will also be considered the work period commencement date. For those of you that started work prior to this date, we ask that you please provide your program officer with the date that you actually began work so that it can be reflected in your D1. Otherwise, you may have issues receiving reimbursements for any work completed prior to the work period commencement date. From there, you have 18 months to execute the agreement. This is known as the agreement execution date, and that'll be July 16th, 2025. We do recommend that you execute your agreement sooner rather than later, since you cannot receive your first reimbursement until your grant agreement is fully executed. You must begin work within the 24-month period following the work period commencement date. This is your project commencement deadline. For this grant round, it is January 16th, 2026. The funded project must be completed within 4 years of the agreement commencement date, making that January 16th, 2028. And then finally, the agreement itself will expire 5 years after the agreement commencement date on January 16th, 2029. This allows you an extra year after your work is completed to close out your grant. Extensions on these grants are not assumed and are only advised in extenuating circumstances. They must be requested and then approved by our Grants and Loans Committee. So we encourage working closely with your consultant to ensure that you follow these deadlines and dates as closely as possible, because it may be hard to get an extension if your agreement expires. These dates will appear in your D1 scope of work, so don't worry if you aren't able to jot all of them down now. Again, we do strongly encourage that you keep these dates in front of you and or on your calendars so that you can keep your project as close to on schedule as possible. Next slide, please. So in addition to defining the scope of work, we also use the D1 to identify your project team. All consultants working on the grant-funded project must be approved by trust staff and must meet our professional qualification standards. If you included resumes and project proposals from consultants in your original application, they are considered approved unless you have been informed otherwise. If you did not include consultants in your original application, you must submit resumes and project proposals to your program officer to have them approved by the trust before work can begin. If you're unsure if your project team is appropriate or if they have been approved by trust staff, please contact your program officer directly. Next slide, please. Now I just want to bring your attention to the trust project requirements for all funded work. All work must meet the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. This is part of your program officer's job to review the submitted work to ensure that it meets the standards. Additionally, archaeology or consideration of archaeology is required for any project that involves ground disturbance. All projects will be reviewed for archaeological considerations before the D1 is finalized and the grant agreement can be executed. Finally, publicly owned resources may require work authorizations. This is very project specific, so please reach out to your program officer if you have any questions or concerns regarding that. Next slide, please. Finally, the state of New Jersey also has some requirements that our grantees are required to comply with. All of these are laid out in tab 3 of your grant manual. These requirements can be somewhat nuanced and complex, so it's extremely important that your CFO reviews tab 3 of your grant manual in depth to familiarize themselves with these requirements. One of these requirements is the audit requirement. So if your organization receives more than $100,000 in state and or federal grants in any given fiscal year, you will be required to submit an audit. Even if your New Jersey Historic Trust grant is less than $100,000, your organization may be receiving grants from other federal or state entities within a single fiscal year. If those amounts combined exceed $100,000, you will be required to submit an audit. Audit costs are non-reimbursable, and your organization will have to budget for this cost of the audit outside of this project. Our grants also have an affirmative action requirement. Our grantees, their consultants, and contractors are required to comply with the state of New Jersey's affirmative action laws. It's especially important that you have the non-discrimination language and policy in any proposals or contracts related to your grant-funded activities. Your consultants are going to be required to show proof of compliance to the State Contract Compliance Unit through the Department of Treasury. There are a few ways they can demonstrate this compliance, and more information regarding that can be found in your grant manual. If you have any specific questions about the affirmative action compliance, they can be directed to the Contract Compliance Unit. The last requirement is prevailing wage. This only applies to our county and municipal grantees or to any nonprofits whose sites are owned by county, municipal, or state governments. So if your site is owned by a county, municipal, and or state government, you will be required to adhere to prevailing wage. And that about wraps it up for me in this section. Are there any questions? And it doesn't look like there are.
Yeah, so right now there are no open questions.
Great. So I'm going to pass things off to Alexis, and she's going to talk about our archaeological requirements.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alexis, and I'm the Trust Staff Archaeologist. I'm going to briefly review the archaeological requirements of trust-funded projects, which are in place to comply with State Historic Preservation Office standards. Next slide, please. So even if the primary goal of your project is not an archaeological investigation, you are required to consider archaeology if you have any ground disturbing activities planned. I won't read this full list, but here you can see some examples of the kinds of activities that have required archaeological consideration in past trust projects, which have included the excavation of trenches for utility service and site drainage, excavation related to ADA site improvements, and the construction or expansion of walkways, driveways, and parking areas. If you have broad-scale site improvements planned for your site now or in the future, we strongly recommend that you consider the preparation of an archaeological management plan, which, similar to a preservation plan, will offer guidance for overall preservation efforts, address specific archaeological needs, and ensure that future activities consider and or avoid potential effects to archaeological resources. Next slide, please. At this point in the process, you should have already considered archaeology and have a plan for addressing it if needed. Your next step toward fulfilling the archaeological requirements for your project should be to select a qualified professional archaeologist and involve them in your project early so they can help ensure that archaeological resources that may exist on site are treated appropriately. Keep in mind that an archaeological evaluation will need to be completed before any ground disturbance. It's a good idea to handle the archaeological component of your project early in case any activities requiring ground disturbance need to occur that you hadn't planned on, such as soil survey that might require trenching or probing, or in case something is discovered that might necessitate some alterations to your plans. I'd also like to note at this point that archaeological monitoring may be employed only in select circumstances. The decision to utilize monitoring as your archaeological approach must be made by a qualified professional archaeologist and must be approved by the Historic Trust prior to beginning work. We've had projects in past years where monitoring was assumed by the grantee or others on the project team to be an acceptable approach, but wasn't, which set project plans, budgets, and timelines behind due to the need for more substantial archaeological testing. All of this can be avoided with proper planning in advance. And if you're unsure whether your current project plans require archaeology or how to select an archaeologist, please contact myself or your program officer so we can discuss the specifics of your project in more detail. Next slide, please. And while the scientific value of what you might uncover archaeologically is invaluable on its own, archaeology has the added benefit of being just interesting. Taking the opportunity to share the archaeology at your site with the people who visit and love it serves as an excellent avenue for increasing public engagement. We've seen a number of successful public archaeology projects here at the Trust where the public have been invited to not only observe the archaeology taking place on site, but also to participate in it. Depending on the scope of your archaeological investigation you'll be undertaking, archaeology can be used as a training opportunity as well, allowing for collaboration with local professional archaeologists and universities to build mutually beneficial partnerships that might broaden your network as well as serve the next generation of archaeologists by offering them excavation experience. And on top of all these wonderful benefits, archaeology can give new insight into your site and add to your understanding of its use and development over time, as well as provide you with artifacts to display and interpret from your own grounds. And as always, please feel free to contact myself or your program officer if you have any questions pertaining to the archaeological components of your current projects or any future projects that you're considering. Are there any questions?
We do have a question that just came in. I'm not sure if it pertains necessarily to archaeology, but Sue wants to know, they did not receive their grant agreement this month. Was it sent certified mail? Anybody has the answer for that?
Yeah, we have not sent out grant agreements yet. We're still in the process of preparing them. We sent out the info packets. Actually, we sent out the info packets, which we need completed and returned to us so that we can actually do the grant agreement. So grant agreements won't go out until we've all agreed on the scope of work and you've returned the info packets with us to us for with that information that will go into the grant agreements. Hopefully that took care of that question, I hope.
Thank you, Glenn. That was our only open question.
Great. Well, in that case, I'll turn it over to my colleague Vito, who will now describe the process for administering an active grant.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vito Scacozo. I'm another one of the program officers here at the Historic Trust. So now we're going to talk about how you administer and how you work with an active grant. So first of all, I want to let everyone know that the information covered in this section, as well as much more information and answers to many common questions that we get, can all be found in your grant manual that everyone had previously mentioned, and that we'll talk about a little bit further. But I believe it is chapter 4 of the grant manual has step-by-step for how to submit for reimbursement and all this information that we're going to talk about here. So that manual really is your go-to guide for any questions you have, or you can always reach out to your program officer. Next slide, please. So the first thing to know about administering an active grant is that communication with the trust is key. Whether it's prior to construction and sending us your construction drawings, the pre-qualification of your contractors, bids for review, or during construction, whether you have meeting notices or meeting minutes if we can't attend, all of those things are important to communicate with us. So for example, here on the slide, you should be sending to the trust planning documents funded by the grant, including 2 hard copies and 1 digital copy when applicable, construction drawings and specifications, contractor pre-qualification forms in draft form, or when completed by their contractors, and accepted bids for review. And then during construction, we should receive all meeting notices. In many cases, we do like to attend where we can to see the project status. But if we can't attend, we also like to receive all meeting minutes, whether for review if we were there, or for review if we were not there, so we can make sure we're following along with your project accurately. And you are responsible as the grantee for all communication. One thing I will mention here is if changes need to happen with your scope of work, do that ahead of time so that we can make sure it meets Secretary of the Interior standards. and amend grant agreements as needed. And if consultants are not yet selected, you should review them with us and submit their information before signing any contracts with them so we can make sure that they meet the federal qualification standards. Next slide, please. So you'll also be communicating to us through quarterly reporting. These reports are due 4 times a year. The dates listed here are April 15th, July 15th, October 15th, and January 15th. So your first quarterly report should be coming up this April. The first report is very important to set a baseline and provide information. So make sure that you're reviewing in the grant manual and in your grant agreement once it's executed what is all entailed in this quarterly report so that you can make sure that you can get that first one down and have that baseline set. So the attachment C1, which is the first page seen here on the right, is the start of your quarterly report in your grant agreement and includes a narrative about your project status, a team list of who's working on your project at this time, an active project schedule, any submissions that you have for us at that time, and then certification that the report is completed to the best of your ability and is wholly accurate. This report should be submitted via email if there is no reimbursement request included. If a reimbursement is being requested at the same time as this quarterly report, we do request that you submit it via postal delivery, as the payment voucher, as previously mentioned, must have an original signature. And if there's no activity and your project's kind of in a lull, still just fill out a quick report and send it to us via email, even if there's no major activity, just so we know that's what's going on and we keep that communication line active. Next slide, please. So with reimbursement requests, you can submit your first reimbursement request after your grant agreement has been executed, your project sign is installed, and that there is an easement recorded if it is required. Each request for reimbursement must include all necessary documentation of invoices and proof of payment from your financial institution, such as a canceled check. During construction, requests should include additional documentation not already submitted as part of your reports, such as meeting minutes, progress photographs, and any change orders if there are any. Most importantly, as I mentioned on the last slide, your payment voucher is the most important part of your reimbursement request. We cannot reimburse you any funds without a properly completed payment voucher. This is an example seen here on the right of what that payment voucher looks like. It requires the original signature of the designated CFO of your organization. Payment takes approximately 3 weeks after the receipt of your reimbursement request for processing, and registering for direct deposit payments through the state's ACH system can expedite that payment process. A little bit more about that project sign and that easement that I had mentioned. So the project sign is outlined in the grant manual with specifications on sizing and language requirements for further review. And the easement is for properties owned by nonprofit owners, so state, county, or municipal owners, or grantees that are nonprofits, but property is owned by a state or municipal entity are not required to have an easement, and that is for grants in excess of $50,000. That easement must be recorded with your county before any reimbursement requests can be submitted. And then we can go ahead and jump to the next slide. Okay. So for work product review, we should be reviewing any work product prior to construction and during construction if there are planning documents ahead of time. And then we should be reviewing plans and specifications both as draft submissions and as final documents to make sure if there were any trust comments, they were incorporated as needed. Bid packages must also be approved by the trust before distribution, as well as any pre-qualification packages if they are required. Jump to the next slide, please. So as I had previously mentioned, there is different required signage requirements. So the trust requires a temporary project sign during the construction period. An example of that is that top picture there with the preserved in nice big letters as the project sign that is up during construction and during the project. And then we also require the installation of a permanent marker or plaque for completed construction projects. Some grantees opt to incorporate this information for a marker into larger interpretive signage, such as this bottom image here with the sign. Other people may be used to like a bronze National Register plaque. So there's wiggle room there and what exactly that looks like, and we're happy to work with your organization to find the best fit for your resource. Next slide, please. And so as I had previously mentioned, nonprofit owned properties with grant awards over $50,000 will be required to have a term easement on their property. The length of that term depends on the exact amount of the grant award. For example, if your grant award is $50,000 to $100,000, the term is 15 years. If your award is $100,001 to $450,000, that will be for 20 years. And if your grant award is for $450,000 or more, your term of your easement will be 30 years. And that term begins at the closing of your grant agreement. So whatever, as Shannon had mentioned, your project end date or your grant agreement expiration date, that is the date upon which this term easement will take over. Next slide, please. So we also require the pre-qualification of contractors for all projects, including pre-qualification regulations and a bidder's questionnaire, examples of which can all be found in your capital grant manual that we have previously mentioned. Pardon me. And so also for units of government, you must coordinate the pre-qualification and bidding process with DCA's Division of Local Government Services as well. Pardon me. So the process is outlined in our grant manual and includes details regarding advertising requirements for your project in local newspapers, trade publications, or other sources of publication, and as well as review by the trust of any information required of your pre-qualifying packages. Any project in excess of grant funds of more than $100,000 must be publicly advertised for bidding and for qualification. Next slide, please. Sometimes there are cases where you need to amend your grant agreement. Reasons to amend the grant agreement include changes to the project schedule, revising your scope of work, or there's a change in the consultant or contractor completing your project. The request for major change paperwork is included in your grant agreement, noted here as being attachment D2. You should be completing these requests before the end of work period or the grant agreement deadline, not after things have already expired. And all requests are reviewed by our Grants and Loans Committee and then passed on to our Board of Trustees. The general terms and conditions of the grant agreement are non-negotiable, and amendments to the grant agreement are not always approved, so make sure you have proper information supporting your request before submission. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Jennifer to talk about the closeout process for grant agreements.
Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer and I will be discussing the closeout process. So while it may be some time before anyone here closes out their grant, it is still important to go through this process now. This process is very important because you will not receive the remaining balance of your grant until you submit completed closeout paperwork and it is approved by the trust staff. And let me repeat, you will not receive the remaining balance of your grant until you close out paperwork is submitted and approved by the trust. Next, please. So in order to close out your capital grant, you will need to complete the C2 form included with your grant agreement. The C2 form is in two parts. One part is the retainage reimbursement form. The second part is the final performance report. And both parts need to be complete to close out your grant. So please follow the itemized checklist on this form. And now to have a complete reimbursement form, you must submit copies of all invoices and canceled checks or proof of payments that were not part of your other reimbursement requests. And if you submitted all invoices and canceled checks at this point, then remember that you are still due a retainage fee. So you will need to complete this form regardless. We also need a payment voucher included with your grant agreement that has an original signature from your CFO to consider this reimbursement section complete. Next, please. As for the final performance report, here is a list of items it must include to properly close out your capital grant. First, include a narrative that explains how your project went. We also request hard and digital copies of before and after photos of your project. A photo of the permanent plaque, if your grant is in excess of $50,000, should also be included. Employment figures from consultants and contractors that will provide information about how many tradespeople and how many professionals have worked on your project must be included. We also ask that if there is a revised scope of work, if necessary, that includes information such as unexpected work items, the reduction of the scope of work, if there's a cost overrun. These are just examples. Please include this with your closeout paperwork. And if there is a revised scope of work, it should not be a surprise to your program officer at the closeout process. So please keep your program officer updated with all scope changes. In addition, the final report will include the final total project costs, as well as built drawings. So please let your contractors know now, or as soon as you're able, that they will need to provide as-built drawings. And finally, we ask for a closeout letter from your consultant certifying that your project is complete. And just so everyone is aware, you can submit some of these items throughout the work period. You don't need to wait until the very end to submit everything, but please make sure all these documents reflect the final result of your project. Once everything is submitted and approved, your program officer will then be able to file the paperwork for the disbursement of your remaining grant balance and/or the retainage fee, then close out your grant. If you want more information, Chapter 4, the grant manual, has a breakdown of the closeout process. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please call or email us. Next, please. Now, briefly for multi-phase projects, all subsequent capital phases are contingent on the completion or the substantial completion of the current capital phase. Let your program officer know when this completion date is approaching so that the next chunk of funding is included in the upcoming appropriations bill. Also to note is that we do require a new grant agreement for the next proposed phase of work. While you are able to continue work during this process, you will not be able to provide a reimbursement until you have a fully executed grant agreement. And if you do continue to work, please keep trust staff updated so that your work is meeting, to make sure your work is meeting the standards and that your expenses are allowable. Are there any questions?
I also just want to jump in here quickly, Jennifer, once again. As Jennifer had mentioned, that we do have a retainage fee that we do hold of your grant funds. And also for clarification for how the reimbursement process works. So your reimbursement is not going to be a one-to-one match of your costs in that period to the funds that you receive. So we do use a multiplier based on your grant type. So for example, our Capital One grant program is a 60-40 grant funds to match ratio. So we use a multiplier of 0.57 of your funds in that period, equaling times that multiplier to equal your reimbursement. For Capital 2 and for Capital III-Multiphase, that multiplier is 0.475 to represent the 50-50 of grant funding to match funds. And you can, that 0.57 and 0.475 aren't the exact 60 and 50%, due to us holding that slight retainage that is released to you at your closeout of the grant. Again, all of that information is outlined in your grant manual in detail, and those multipliers are all included in your reimbursement request forms, so they're there available to you at all times when you're submitting that request.
Thank you, Vito. And now Ashley will discuss publicizing your project.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I just want to thank you for hanging in there with us. We're in the home stretch now. As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Ashley Parker. I am the Heritage Tourism Coordinator here at the Trust. And today I will be going over how publicity can play an important role in your project. So if you're following along with us using your grant manual, this is section 4, page 4.55. Next slide, please. So some goals for your publicity program. So publicity helps maintain visibility of your project and organization during the preservation campaign. It can increase attendance or membership for your programs and activities, and can also attract new funding support and additional resources. Next slide. So publicizing your project also promotes and raises awareness of history and historic preservation in New Jersey. It also helps ensure ongoing funding for historic preservation. So good publicity opportunities are grant award announcements and check presentations, project milestones such as groundbreaking or ribbon cutting ceremonies, tours, special events, and profiles of volunteers, staff, or special craftsmen, or letters to your legislatures and representatives. And most of these opportunities can be achieved by news or journal articles about your project, social media posts, or special televised news coverage. So if you're interested in coordinating a check presentation or a grant award announcement, please contact your program officer. We have a large check-in in our office, and it looks fantastic in photos. Next slide, please. So Journey Through Jersey, some of your sites might be eligible for inclusion. It's the state's go-to website for all things heritage tourism that was launched by the Trust in 2017. The website features heritage tourism destinations throughout the state, in addition to annual events, educational resources, blog posts, and travel itineraries, which are then featured on Journey Through Jersey's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as throughout a comprehensive marketing plan that we are currently working on with an outside consultant. We also host unique educational opportunities for our Journey Through Jersey site managers. So for instance, 10 Journey Through Jersey participants received complimentary registration to the Travel and Tourism Conference for the past 2 years. So we highly encourage you to nominate your visitor-ready site. We will publicize your resource for free, so we encourage you to take advantage. You will also receive a welcome packet upon joining. The only thing that we ask in return is, as a participating resource, that you include the Journey Through Jersey logo with a link to the website on your organization's homepage. So if you'd like to learn more about this unique opportunity, or would like to be featured, or if you're interested in writing a blog post, please contact me directly. And my contact information can be found at the end of this presentation or on the Trust website. Next slide. So help us help you promote your project by staying in touch with us. The Trust is active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And we encourage you to tag us in your posts, send us news coverage, progress photos, events, or any other content that you would like us to share. There are no guarantees, but we do like to post as much as we can. We also kindly ask that you reshare our posts and link to our website in order to help us raise awareness about funding opportunities and historic preservation in New Jersey. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'd like to turn the presentation back over to my colleague, Kristen, if there's any additional questions that we might be able to address for you.
Thank you, Ashley. Right now we have no open questions, but everybody can feel free to put any last minute questions in. I'm going to go ahead and ask all the panelists to make sure that your cameras are on. I'm going to change the view so that everyone can see your beautiful faces. And we'll just see if any questions come in.
I know our team did a great job today, but I can't believe there are no follow-up questions. I mean, I'm happy, but I'm surprised. But again, this is a lot of information, and as everyone has mentioned, all this information is also included in your grantee manual, which is accessible, through our website. Well, if we're not getting any questions, I'm just going to say thank you all and congratulations once again. But see, I spoke too soon. We have a question coming in.
This is a Glenn specific question. They would like to know when you became the executive director.
On January 2nd, Dorothy retired at the end of December, and our board brought me on at our December board meeting, actually, and official start date was January 2nd. I'm more than happy to be here. So,
All right.
but again, congratulations to all of you for receiving this grant. You do have your info packets. Please return all the information to us as soon as possible so we can start working on those grant agreements. And I look forward to seeing all these completed projects. They're all very, very exciting. So again, thank you and congratulations.